let's get started then. Max, I would like to ask you first, what exactly was your motivation in starting to write this book? I mean, there are, you saw some kind of missing point in the literature, or maybe some points deliberately ignored in the mainstream climate change politics literature. What was your main motivation?
So I wrote this book to some extent as an accident. In part, it was, of course, it emerged as a reaction to the dominant social democratic discourse, which I was alarmed by how quickly it swept over the North American and, by extension, other lefts, but of course, especially the North American left, and the degree to which the proposals which had emerged from Ocasio-Cortez were being represented as eco-socialist proposals, and that she was being presented as a socialist. Now, this was very obviously a sales operation rather than a reflection of a long-term commitment to social transformation. I mean, this is the dominant political expression, especially in that period, was electoralism, opportunist electoralism of any kind. And so, of course, it shouldn't have been a surprise that, of course, when it was presented with an ecological, with a green paint, it would have the same kind of coordinates, it would have the same kind of opportunism, it would have the same program, and so forth. But nevertheless, what took me aback was the fact that if you actually read what Ocasio-Cortez and Markey were presenting, it was just not an eco-socialist program, right? And this was kind of glossed over in the entire discussion. I tried to publish a number of book reviews, articles about it, let us say like 4 or 5. And people, the editors, were more or less, were not interested in criticizing the Ocasio-Cortez Green New Deal. And I was sort of taken aback. I said, wow, it's a very legitimate thing to criticize political expressions that emerge from dominant people who are held up as leadership of any kind. I mean, you would do that even for actual leaders of the left, like Chavez. So you can certainly do it to someone who has actually no doesn't come out of a revolutionary mass movement like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But nevertheless, it was sort of a firewall, which of course should not have been surprising, right? Because the dominant electoral opportunism is not only a political trend that's reflecting the left wing of capital, more or less, but is also a cultural expression. That is, it is reasserting the ideological legitimacy and building the ideological hegemony of this mode of reacting to social crisis and socio-ecological crisis. So of course, people are naturally going to say, okay, we're not interested in publishing a critique of that. That is power protecting itself, right? So I decided to write the book, in fact, because I thought that there were a lot of things missing. I thought that it was very clearly electoral opportunism. I thought it was not remotely even green social democratic, let alone green socialist. I thought it was extremely blind to demands for national popular development that come from the South. I thought it had nothing at all to say about agriculture or land use in a meaningful way. I thought that it was increasingly infused with technology. I thought it had nothing at all to say about imperialism and the fact that the US is an empire and will continue to be an empire until it either collapses or is dismantled. And therefore, if you don't hit it, it won't fall, to take the words of Comrade Mao. And that finally there was just no discussion of the ecological programs, which had come from anti-systemic movements and anti-systemic states in the third world, which have a long history and reflection, and that should be part of the discussion if one is trying to build a common ecological front. So I thought it was very superficial, it was very lacking, and it was setting the agenda. So I decided, okay, I'm going to push back against it to the extent that I can. And I decided I would take some time out from my historical work, which is on Tunisian national liberation and peasant struggles and post-colonial planning, and write this book.
We know that these Green New Deals are trying to transform the capitalism. You know, the growth will be the same growth, but its color will be green at the end of the day. And do you think we can consider them as some kind of Trojan horses inside which capitalism is trying to hide itself? Or what can you elaborate on the potential political position of these GNDs and their campaigners and advocates?
So, you know, I had more of it in an earlier draft of the book, and it would have required a great deal of journalism and would have made it even more US specific, which I didn't quite want to do, because it's already, unfortunately, maybe too US specific. And but yes, if you look at the trajectory of Ocasio-Cortez, if you look at the trajectory of some of the people who are talking about a Green New Deal in 2018, 2019, right? These were plans for basically the recomposition and the political recomposition of capitalism through these kind of electoral insurgencies that were basically trying to gather up people who were disaffected, especially downwardly mobile, petty bourgeois. I mean, this is actually fundamentally Ocasio-Cortez's constituency, with a lot of emphasis, for example, in the tech industries. You know, there's a wide, for example, if you look at DSA, you know, DSA is a very, is a beast with many heads, of course, but there's a constituency within DSA, for example, that comes from tech and is making six-figure income, right? I mean, this is not your standard constituency for revolutionary socialism, right? You know, there's class traders, but then there's constituencies, and these are two different things. So, you know, a lot of this was, and like, there were people like Rihanna Gunn Wright and so forth, who were basically proposing, they were saying, okay, our new plan for the right wing of, our new plan for the kind of rebuilding the hegemony of capitalism within the imperial core is going to brand it as an ecological program, right? And therefore gain the ear of those people who were also concerned about the ecological crisis. Now, so this was crystal clear, right? I mean, this story of Ocasio-Cortez emerging from the grassroots, I mean, she was very much a curated candidate, right? And so this is a Trojan horse. You know, the Trojan horse was kind of built around her after the fact. She was almost very clear about what she was doing at the outset of her candidacy. And then you had publications, including, you know, unfortunately, Jacobin was at the lead of this, who were building a Trojan horse around her and saying, okay, yes, she's a leftist. And it was just, you know, it was quite shocking. And it, I think, succeeded substantially in muddying the waters. And probably the most negative aspect is that if you look in, I think it's probably different to some extent in Turkey and so forth. And I know it's different to some extent in Tunisia because people experience the climate crisis as a crisis of immediate social reproduction, right? But for people who have left-wing, anti-imperialist, even Marxist-Leninist politics in the core, I don't think a lot of people are very interested in the ecological crisis. And they understandably are much more focused on state sovereignty. And this is in part a reaction, I think, to the way this discourse, it was, the ecological crisis was used as a way to just push forward this opportunist and imperialist electoralism.
The first part of your book is about describing the political tendencies of these Green New Deals and theoretical part. And in the second part, you focus on people's Green New Deal, and you talk about some kind of blueprints of this Green New Deal, and you summarize them in three main points that are agroecology, anti-imperialism, and national liberation, and some topics from urban planning to transportation and stuff. And I would like to start first with the agroecology part. Why you think it's one of the key stones in your Green New Deal proposal, and how do you think it's related to the other pillars or other main headings in your deal?
You know, for the imperial core states, of course, everyone knows that the percentage of the population active in agriculture, even including migrant workers, is very low, right? So it, of course, there's in that sense, one could say there's an imbalance in the book, but this imbalance is a reflection of the fact that agriculture was not being discussed at all in the dominant proposals. And when it was being discussed in extremely technocratic or industrial terms that were very much divorced from you know, the cutting edge science that has been developing over the last 30 years about sustainable planning, agroecological planning, land management, the role of agriculture and a potential carbon drawdown, the role of, never mind the role of agriculture in third world development and third world socio-ecological development, where it's just, it's an absolute keystone sector. So part of it was writing back against that. And part of it was explaining to people that, you know, that in spite of the fact that a relatively low population of the core is involved in agriculture, first of all, it's the very dominant sector when it comes to land use. And second of all, it's threaded throughout a large number of other sectors. And it's also a major sector for emissions. So it's something people need to come to terms with, because there's a lot, especially in the West, but also we can say certainly in the South, right? Especially amongst, I think, a large portion of the intelligentsia in the South too. I mean, the West is just beyond belief, right? There's a widespread alienation from the agrarian question and agriculture, right? I mean, it's to varying degrees in different countries, to be sure. A lot of countries, of course, have very strong traditions of studying these issues. This now, I don't mean to say otherwise, but it's not essential as it needs to be, both North and South. So we're saying, okay, here's the structure of the world food system. And here's how that food system can be transformed as part of a broader socialist transformation of our world system. And so it's also the fact that a lot of our, and honestly, the book didn't go into it enough, but a lot of the things we're sick with, or that undermine health, which is to say, you know, damage social reproduction and so forth, are related to agriculture and food consumption, right? This is, and it's not into it enough, because there's an agrarian question of food that is actually critical for social transformation, and in terms of actually improving not quantity, but rather the quality of use values available to poor human beings, because wealthy people have access to better food, especially in the poor, but in the poorer populations, it's huge concerns. So it was wanting to get into these topics and say, okay, you can't discuss a Green New Deal without discussing agriculture. And you can't discuss agriculture unless you really, at least to a large extent, put ecological forms of agriculture front and center. That is, you need to focus on agriculture that is safeguarding the soil, and you need to focus on agriculture that is diverse, so it's drought resilient, so it's flooding resilient. You need to focus on agriculture that is not flooding toxins into waterways. You need to focus on agriculture that is not producing systemic cancers, both amongst people who are living close to the agricultural areas and having pesticides, but also people who are consumers of those goods. You also need an agriculture that's carbon negative. Right, in principle, agriculture is part of the national carbon cycle, right? Carbon cycles, and so you're always going to produce greenhouse gases when you do agriculture. It's very normal, but the conversion of agriculture into an emissions emitting sector, right? One of the major ones, right? Between 25 and 37%, with most future increases actually coming from processing and transport. It's actually, in many ways, it's one of the easier sectors to get to zero. It's not like concrete where we have, although I don't think we need to build with as much concrete as we do, but it's not like concrete. It's not like building hospitals. And it's not like metal where we have maybe insuperable technical difficulties in terms of getting to zero. Agriculture can essentially be below zero, because you can not only sow carbon into the soil, but you can build new soil. And the potential for building new soil is essentially limitless. And you're actually capable, at least in principle, of pulling down carbon from the atmosphere. And so insofar as these types of what are called by the right-wing proposals natural climate solutions, insofar as they entered the discourse on what passes for the North American left, it entered the discourse via these calls for like veganism and mass afforestation or reforestation, especially in the third world, and which is actually just a catastrophic top-down intervention that runs against the grain of actually what we have is a very rich body of knowledge from natural scientists who probably are not mostly socialists, but nevertheless have an extremely rich body of knowledge about how to manage the natural landscape on a world scale. I mean, they have a very rich knowledge of mechanisms. They have a very rich knowledge of the landscapes that were here before they were disturbed by the aggressive capitalist industrialization of agriculture. They have a very rich knowledge of what was there before the introduction of monocultures, the ecological logic of traditional farming, and even how to improve the yields and so forth, and the stability of the yields in ecological farming. There's a very sound knowledge of sustainable extensive pastoralism, and there's agroforestry and how to intercut trees with pastoralism, with annual and perennial crops and so forth. And it just was shocking to me that this was totally absent from the conversation, when actually it's something everybody should understand at some level. Not everyone needs to be a deep expert in it, but it's a way of, not only is it very central, it's central in the periphery, it's central in the core, and it's also central in order to create ideological glue between Northern and Southern movements, right? Whereas, because especially in the North, the Southern agrarian question is totally dismissed, right? It was a huge crisis when it comes to understanding the nature of our world system.
Yeah, how did you conclude that people's Green New Deal must favor national liberation, and how do you think it can help in struggling with climate change impacts?
Of course, in fact, it's an implicit, but not as explicit as it should be, but very valid critique, and I've been thinking about it a lot more since I wrote the book. National liberation is, unfortunately, at least in the West, it's often been equated with state sovereignty, maybe with some kind of nostalgia now for 60s and 70s efforts at post-colonial development and new international. Now, this is not, these were very important historical experiences, but this is not what national liberation is. National liberation was constituted against Northern monopoly capital and its Southern extensions, the Southern kind of bleed-overs, the Southern social support structures through which Northern monopoly capitalism exploited Southern workers. So national liberation is structurally a challenge both to the flow of value from the South to the North and the domestic social structures in the South that maintain that flow of value, which is what Nkrumah, but with more precision, Cabral referred to as neocolonial. That is a transformation, some kind of transformation in the political structures towards formal sovereignty, but with continued value flows with a certain, for a shorthand, we call it comprador class, although it has a lot of baggage, being the one maintaining, basically stewarding or maintaining or supervising that continued flow of value and getting their cut of value. So national liberation is about putting the national productive forces, agriculture, and labor, and other things, at the service of the popular class. This is the essence of national liberation. National liberation is not about, is at a theoretical level and at a programmatic level, is about that, right? It's about putting the productive forces at the service of the people for national popular development, including sovereign industrialization. And for Cabral, national liberation and socialist planning were exactly the same thing, right?
one can understand why this lost some of its clarity, because Cabral, for reasons that were clear in his context, could not come out as a Marxist in a clear way. But it's clear, he says clearly that it's the same as socialism. So it's not about supporting your national bourgeoisie in principle. Now, this has, so when it comes to the ecological crisis, the ecological, and we need more work on this, but the ecological crisis is a crisis of the under-reproduction of peripheral nature in many ways, right? The ecological crisis is registered, it hammers people when it passes through the membrane of class structure. And this is, poor people are suffering from climate change, including in the poor, including in the US, including, and a popular ecological development plan is stating, okay, we need to improve as we respond to climate change, we need to at least protect people's lives, if not improve people's lives, in the process of responding to climate change. Now, national liberation reminds us that there is a process of value drain occurring from the south to the north, and there is a process of under-reproduction of nature, which is occurring primarily, but not wholly, in the south, right? And that is where the impacts of climate change are felt heaviest. And I think this needs to be reworked at the theoretical level, which I'm working on in the follow-up to this book. I think so. National liberation is the lens. There's other issues that are, in fact, much more specific to the contemporary U.S. context, which I think are not, which are deliberately submerged in, especially the North American and European. I think it has of course, it reflects a Eurocentric. But above all, the U.S. agenda in periphery right now is the de-development and collapse of entire societies, right? The sanctions regimes that are imposed, the wars that are imposed, the proxy wars that are imposed. Right?
So, the northern imperialist policies are collapsing entire social formations, right? Practically taken as aggregates. And of course, this too is registered on unequal lines in the South. When you take a country like Iran, or you take a country like Venezuela, or you take a country like Syria and Yemen, of course, the impact of the collapse and the de-development of these social formations is felt differently running through internal class structures, of course. Of course, this is the case. But what monopoly capital is doing, what imperialism is doing, as the policies and the extra-national policies of monopoly capital is actually collapsing entire peripheral social formations, and this is underappreciated, I think, in especially the northern or deliberately ignored in the northern left, in the European and Euro-American left, where calls for solidarity with working class people end up erecting an atmosphere of legitimation for the US policies of the collapse of peripheral development. If you take Syria, Syria's developmental level is back at 1960 right now, right? So they've lost 60 years of development. And it has nothing to do with one's opinion on Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad did not want to de-develop his society 60 years, right? That was what the US wanted to do. So, these perspectives, I think, are very much lost now they're being restored, but they are not, at least when I was writing the book, they were very much absent in the Northern climate discourse. They were totally absent in the Northern climate discourse. And I thought it's very important that people understand it. It's very hard for a country like Venezuela or Zimbabwe to construct domestic eco-socialism under US sanctions, right? That are debauching the currency and setting off hyperinflation and so forth. In fact, they do have to do it under US sanctions because the US isn't going to cease its hostility to them. But nevertheless, it should be appreciated the difficulty of the challenges they face, and the Northern role in the burden of world social transformation cannot just be an abstract solidarity, but should actually be removing the US role in the destruction of Southern social formations.
But there's this tendency, even on the left, to separate the
question of climate, or basically prioritize climate stabilization to such an extent, everything political, if I may say so, should basically left aside until we achieve certain gains in terms of the climate struggle. So what's your take? I mean, I can't hear your answer, but what's your take on this? Is a purely climate struggle actually possible? Well, part of your answers so far have addressed this question, the national question and others, but what do you think about this purist, if I may put it so, climate approach?
Yeah. So, well, of course it's possible, but I think it's not exactly a struggle anymore. Right. So, for example, in principle, if you're willing to do anything to end the climate crisis, then someone could agree to buy out all the northern oil companies on terms that their shareholders and executives are willing to accept, and make northern middle classes and southern countries pay the bill for it. Southern countries that actually rely much more structurally on oil exports. Right. So you can always take measures. It's always possible to take measures in principle that deal with the ecological crisis while being blind to the social reproduction or the class distributional aspects of any form of transformation of the socio-ecological texture of production, right? It's totally, not only is it feasible to do it, but some variety of that is what's on the table from the World Economic Forum, from Stortelen Foundation, from Eat Lancet, from Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, from the UNDP and their latest Human Development Report, and so forth. Right? I mean, they basically, the concept that is carrying these efforts is the concept of the Anthropocene, and it's logical. If humanity or industrial humanity is the one responsible for climate crisis, and it's not different classes within industrial humanity and different investors and different corporations, but just industrial humanity that are responsible for the climate crisis, it would be logical that it is you can just take a purely class-blind approach to resolving the ecological crisis, or especially the climate crisis, through technological shifts and through some institutional shifts, but without shifts in the class structure. So this is the approach being pushed by the right. Now, what I think is significant, actually, is at the same time, is that even these approaches do not have traction amongst the ruling class yet, right? Even these approaches are not really being implemented. And even these approaches, in terms of any kind of immediate reduction in CO2 emissions, even if at a very low level, at a very low rate, they're not really being implemented, right? Which just means the ruling class is not at all interested in dealing at all yet with the climate crisis. And this is what I wrote in the Turkish introduction, right? That it's a fact that they are just not interested in dealing with it yet. And then their disinterest in it reciprocally feeds the idea amongst some kind of vaguely liberal progressive folks that, okay, we need to build a common front with the enlightened sectors of the ruling class who do want to do something about the ecology. Probably I don't need to go on too much, but it's clear that such a policy means that you're saying, okay, most of the world for the next 40 years will live in absolute misery. It just won't be climate misery. And then the class struggle will continue, right? And I think this is not a serious proposal for the left on a world scale. I think it's a poison pill.
Yeah, actually, that takes us to the question, strategy, tactics, and agency. So how do you envisage a People's Green New Deal in a country, say, like the United States, to be achieved? Because at times in the book, you mentioned that part of the proposals you make are basically incompatible with the capitalist mode of production, right? And they, in a way, presuppose the working classes and oppressed seizing power, at least partially. So this is the big question, of course, and I'm not expecting you to come up with like a clear-cut answer to this, but what does it imply for the now and here? And in this sense, how do we contemplate the Green New Deal as basically a program, a tactical program to mobilize the masses, or as a transitional program, which I know you try to avoid that in the books. But let's talk some about the tactics and strategy and the agency question.
Right. I mean, of course, one of the difficulties is that the North is built on what some are calling an imperial way of life, right? Which extends to, which works by weaving lower class people who are facing exploitation and privation and ecological crisis, for that matter, in the North, weaves them into the capitalist mode of production, including its technological aspects, right? So there's a huge, huge difficulty. Of course, I mean, for my own politics, you know, I'm a communist. So it's not that I'm averse to party formations. And I think there's people struggling with how to, for example, turn the DSA into a communist party, a Marxist party. And I applaud their efforts. The problem maybe is, in a sense, that although there's a lot of ideological delegitimization of capitalism, and there is a widespread ideological legitimization of communism and socialism, even as systemic alternatives, you know, it's still the dominant, when it comes to actual decision making within political formations, you have both North and South, right? And this is what I discussed in my book. You have a form of accommodation to the existing system, right? And this ideology is hard to shake, frankly. I don't know enough to talk about how that is playing out in the Turkish context, but we saw it in Latin America, right? It's the idea that socialism is still on the agenda has really been dealt a blow in Latin America, in spite of the fact that it's an atmosphere, thank God, of permanent insurrection in Latin America. But the idea of socialism as the idea of social control and social planning and widespread decommodification, I mean, this lost its grip on both a lot of the intelligentsia and a lot of the popular classes with some of the defeats that they suffered, right? So this is kind of the background against which I had to think about strategy and tactics. I mean, so part of it is how can people in the core make conditions better for people struggling in the periphery towards moving towards substantial decommodification and social control of the productive forces, right? Which is why anti-imperialism is so central. Another aspect that I think is very central, of course, is there need to be proposals for and work done in order to weave together those sectors of U.S. production that are, in principle, that are either central to a green transition and that are already exist to some extent. I mean, so in principle, you can build from the bottom up in terms of ecological transformation in herding or an ecological transformation in the farming system, where a lot of farmers themselves, what are left of them, are not, farming is not a profitable business in the United States. It's corporations like Archer Daniels Midland and so forth that are raking in the profits from farming, and grain traders and so forth. So even if people have a lot of farmland, a staggering amount by any standard, the situation could be very difficult for them. So these are these are sectors of production that would need to be part of, that would need to be organized by a party that extends into, the hinterlands and so forth, and that extends into certain productive sectors, that extends into the electricity unions and so forth, and that moves from a bottom-up way towards the kind of social transformation that is not going to be possible just by throwing people into office, right? This is an absolute, I don't know if it's a dead end, but maybe it won't work for 50 years, right? So it's not a serious alternative to think you can legislate social democracy or socialism into office. So these are, this is why I kind of lifted up these sectors. And I think people who are more engaged on the ground, I mean, I don't generally live in America, need to figure out how to organize this. And, I think we've seen some very smart engagements, for example, recently in the past couple of weeks with people who have tried to organize the building sector, the electricity union sectors. And they said it's very difficult even to get them interested in the ecological crisis, let alone to get them interested in a broader anti-imperialism. So the pressure is always towards opportunism, right? Which is sort of political orientation that is the ideological reflection of the reflection of the dominant ideology, that is the ideology of capital, right? So this is the tableau that people need to move in, and and in a sense, my book was not. It has manifesto aspects, but it needs to be. I've always intended it to be informing conversation amongst political organizers for how to collectively move forward. It wasn't like this is what is to be done. I mean, and as you said, if I knew what is to be done, I'd be doing that shit. I wouldn't, I would be doing that shit. I'd probably be assassinated or something. In a sense, I don't really know what is to be done.
Yeah, true. And also, in a way, we can say between the North and the South, there are not only major differences in terms of, fiscal and technological capacities to basically mobilize resources, both in a social sense and in a technical sense, to basically undertake this all-embracing transition. Societal transition, but also there are differences in terms of approaches of movements and struggles, both climate movements and climate ecological organizations, and also left-wing and socialist organizations. In the North, we usually see basically a categorical rejection of the use of violence, right? There is civilian disobedience and NGOism, whereas in the South, the circumstances, the traditions, and also the objective conditions under which people basically undertake their struggles are different. So what do you observe in this sense? Like, the conditions in the United States to some extent, and you're also very well familiar, at least with a few countries in the South. So what would you say in this respect?
The use of violence, of course, needs to be assessed at a conjunctural level, but of course, there's situations that are only being dealt with successfully with violence. The Palestinian situation is the one that comes to mind first and foremost. I mean, the Palestinian peaceful attempts to deal with the colonial oppression in Palestine have not delivered, and the buildup of an asymmetric resistance capacity has delivered. I mean, this is crystal clear. Of course, there's the point about violence that it's about. I sometimes think it's more about having, I don't want to say categorically, but it's often more about having control of means of violence rather than violence itself. I think this is an important distinction, and it's not applying to all circumstances. But one often needs control of a means of violence in order to avoid violence and protect your own possibility for development. And I think very much of Iran or North Korea's deterrent capacity. And just in case someone watches this, do I think these are ideal societies? No, but this is not even remotely the point. The point is that they are societies that are not being invaded, more or less, by the United States and Israel. Right? And this is because they have a sovereign industrial capacity, which is something underdeveloped in my book totally, but it's something I'm working on for the follow-up. They have a sovereign industrial, and China, of course, the sovereign industrial capacity that gives them means of violence that they then often, that they don't always have to deploy in against existential threat. Again, I mean, the Northern delegitimization of violence is, of course, is quite silly. I mean, I'm just realizing now that there's also there was a polemic which totally escaped my mind, started by Andreas Malm about. I honestly had forgotten because he's so off my radar. About the use of violence by Northern social movements, and. Again, like the violence needs to be assessed by organized political formations that are deciding on their own terms, that have a clear ideological and political horizon, and then are deciding if it really makes sense to use violence, knowing that in the North, as opposed to the South, it's also been very often violence is in general, been most successful as a kind of self-defense mechanism. You have means of violence to avoid violence, and less as an offensive mechanism, right? Except for John Brown, God bless him. And so as for the specific intervention, I mean, as I understand it, the upshot of the intervention from Comrade Malm was eventually that calling for people to go do violence again. It's not violence. Go carry out property destruction. And again, I think there's a deep ethical positionality aspect to this. If you're calling for people to do property destruction, you should do it yourself. Otherwise, these are conversations that are internal to principled political formations that have a clear liberatory horizons. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think we need to convince liberals that we should be allowed to break cars in order to stop fossil capital.
Speaking of contemporary approaches, what about ecofascism? Is it for you a possibility, a potential that is being realized slowly, or basically something rather improbable? And if you regard it as a real possibility, then what means could be used to combat the rise of ecofascism?
Right. So it seems to me that, again, speaking of the North, you have an above aspect and a below aspect, with the below aspect obviously ideologically and probably covertly funded by the state and capital, right? What's called a conspiracy theory in the Northern left. I think ideologically it finds its expression in terms of great replacement theory, in terms of the idea that immigrants are replacing Northerners in terms of declining birth rates for Northern white Europeans, especially, but not only in the United States, but of course also in Europe as well. And you have these kind of Malthusian orientations towards birth rates in the South, blaming the South for overuse of resources. On the quantitative terms, these are not serious arguments, but it doesn't matter whether they're serious or not. I think they acquire grassroots legitimacy. Now, it's not like people in the grassroots are just people in the grassroots, and here we're talking about like fascist Northern Europeans and Americans of European origin, are of course distributing and acting upon an ideology that is given to them from above, right? So you find it in both a liberal form, where there's a lot of talk, for example, Dasgupta talking about intervention in women's reproduction all over the North and the South, and then you find it in like David Attenborough talking about control of people's birth rate and control of world populations, and Jane Goodall talking about a widespread concern. I mean, this is the idea of overpopulation and the need for birth control. My friend Ali Kadri says whenever anyone starts talking about demographics, that's when you reach for your gun, right? Because you know that they're about to just start talking fascism, right? Because you've already departed so much from class. So these are I think the ideological bases for a kind of grassroots buy-in, and even liberal class buy-in for fascism. And then on the other hand, you have the proposals that are actually coming from the right, which obviously, which are coming from the capitalist elite, be it right or be it liberal, with very little difference, and which would require often, I mean, they talk aggressively of the need for a state corporate fusion, state corporate community fusion. I mean, this is coming from Australian breakthrough. I mean, they talk about a wide role for the national security sector in a climate transition. Again, these are proposals coming from Australia. A lot of the proposals for natural climate solutions are very labor intensive. And of course, this can occur on socialist lines, right? I think it's very critical that eco-socialists defend the role and dignity of some type of labor for a socialist transition against these northern proposals, which basically stigmatize labor. I think this is critical in terms of our thinking and our organizing. But at the same time, that labor could also be about paying people super exploitation, north and south, for purposes of maintenance of ecosystem services or carbon farming and so forth. And it could be a means for, and that could be politically regulated by the national security sector. So the proposals, all the building blocks in this sense for fascism are already in place. And we see, especially in the United, again, I follow European politics much less closely, but in the United States, you know, the legislative regression going on is laying the building block for fascism, right? They just agreed that within 100 miles of the border, which is basically the entire country, you don't need a warrant to go into someone's house anymore, right? And what they're deciding in terms of women's reproduction, the invasions in women's reproductive lives, right? This is the direct political control over people's lives, right? And once you remove the right to privacy, you actually basically live in a fascist state anyway, right? So it's occurring on that level already, right? And it's only going to get worse before it would get better.
Yeah, there's actually a follow-up question from the audience. A listener is asking if a Green New Deal, some sort of it, can be utilized as a tool for raising ecofascism. Is this a possibility?
Of course, I mean, I think definitely, but I think most of the proposals, you know, the Ocasio-Cortez Green New Deal failed to find a great deal of popular footing, in fact. The ruling class kind of ignored it for the most part and decided to go its own way in terms of the World Economic Forum, natural climate solutions, and so forth. And it kind of, detector, seller, rare. And it became much more central to the kind of social democratic discussion for a period of time. I mean, any proposal can be, if it doesn't have a sufficient class aspect, class inflection, class emphasis, can be recuperated by liberals and then recuperated by the right. So of course it can happen, but that's why I think it's so central to keep focusing on class and also north-south value flows. And once if we keep those in the forefront every time we raise the ecological issue, it's not gonna, it won't slide into fascism. I mean, I think it's just impossible.
Okay, we can actually go back to some more theoretical questions. Again, a listener from the audience is asking, basically there are different proposals to finance various types of Green New Deals, be it that of AOC or others. So no matter what type of AOC is adopted or being advocated for. So there has to be a finance counterpart. And the listener says that he found that this question was not addressed in length in your book. And he is asking if you could elaborate on your views in this regard. Do you have basically a financing model in your mind, or is there a model among the existing ones that you favor?
You know, for Northern transformation, I mean, it's aggressive taxes for Northern transformations. I mean, it's increased wealth taxes and it's increased wealth taxes, it's increased income taxes, and it's deficit spending. I mean, this is, you know, for financing these things. I mean, whether it's, you know, even what I put out, it's not clear to me that it can be part of a transitional program, because it's not clear to me that a transitional program can get traction in the North. I mean, the South, the situation is of course totally different, right? You know, socialists can take power in the South, not easily, of course, but it can happen. Whereas it isn't going to happen in the short term in the North. I don't see it. So that's why I didn't focus so much on finance. It's also why I didn't focus so much on party organization, because of the difficulties involved. But if the question is, you know, is implicitly maybe about MMT, you know, I don't have a firm position on it. I think that, you know, I think there's a difficulty for Southern transformations in that there is a hard currency constraint, because there's often means of production that are not currently accessible in the South, right? And that are needed, at least in the short to medium term. I mean, China's socialist transformation relied on exports to achieve, to import certain types of industrial goods that were then copied. It's still going on, of course. And, no amount of MMT, it doesn't matter how much your domestic currency, printing your own currency, you need a hard currency that can purchase things that are available only from Northern monopoly capital. In the Northern case, I think it's been we knew already, but it's been clearer than ever that there's a very large scope for deficit spending in the North, right? This can occur on a very wide scale. So the problems posed in terms of financing North and South are, I think, very different. I mean, the South, contrary to what people like Henry Bernstein or whatever say, I mean, you still need to mobilize endogenous capital from productive sectors for transformation in the South. I mean, and that's where agriculture comes in, and even certain forms of relocalization and artisanal manufacturing, and really be thinking about resource constraints and seizing luxury imports and so forth. I mean, I think these are central measures.
Okay, so two more maybe rather theoretical questions. One of the central debates on the left is the relationship or the lack thereof between socialism or eco-socialism and degrowth, which is very controversial. And very recently in Monthly Review, a short piece was published by Michel Levy and Kalis and Bengi Akbulut, who's, I guess, here in the audience right now. And I forgot the fourth author. Anyways, what's
Sabrina Fernandez, I think.
Exactly, Fernandez, yeah. So what's your take on the convergence or divergence between eco-socialism or socialism and degrowth? Should a ecological socialism be, basically, should it entail degrowth or not? What problems do you see, or what commonalities do you see?
Yeah, so I mean, some of the problems I see in some of the degrowth discourse, and I always say some of the degrowth discourse because there's a lot of different degrowthers with different politics, is some of the same problems you see in Northern eco-socialism, right? I mean, with question of the national contradiction, imperialism, North-South value flows, and national liberation, none of this being at the forefront of some Northern eco-socialisms and some Northern degrowths. So for me, it doesn't make sense to pose it as an issue between degrowth and eco-socialism, but actually to focus concretely on what are the political issues that are the political horizons that are shared across both at a wide level, and what are the places where we still need to push better discourses. Now, that's my first comment. I mean, I think historically, degrowth has been somewhat weak on theorizing capital accumulation, right? And political, and class forces and political economy. I mean, historically, that's been a weakness of degrowth, but it's shifting. And there's been a much greater interest in class composition amongst people interested in degrowth. So that's one thing, I mean, which I don't see as a divergence or convergence. I just see that as something that degrowth has been getting better on and needs to get even better on. That's one thing. Another thing is what people more or less openly admit about degrowth is that they consider it a problem of messaging, right? I mean, and it's said that socialism is going to be appealing to people in a way that degrowth is not going to be appealing to Northern working classes. I'm just like, what is appealing to Northern working classes right now? I mean, the situation is very bad in the North and in the South, and we don't have widespread appeal for any good ideas, really, or any sort of political vehicles and political programs, either in the North or in the South. So this idea of like what is or isn't appealing at any given moment, it doesn't hold a lot of water for me, because I'm kind of like, the situation is really bad. Like, and how do you know if your idea is going to be more appealing with to a widespread constituency? And so people will also say that degrowth is a movement of intellectuals. I'm like, well, eco-socialism is also a movement of intellectuals. these are bad faith criticisms, in my opinion. I mean, I don't think they can be taken seriously. I mean, so what strikes me, you know, I have a different set of critiques of sorry for that. I have a different set of critiques of degrowth than the common ones, which are, I still think degrowth needs to pay more attention to the national question and to questions of national liberation in the periphery, and to more systematically theorize South-North value flows. I think it's getting better on this as well. There's a lot of work on ecologically unequal exchange, but I worry that this work is often being pitched in a way that ignores the political dynamics of shifting uneven exchange relationships. And this is something that needs to shift. So if you look, for example, at which forces degrowth considers, you know, it lifts up in the global South. I mean, it is not state forces, right? It is, there's little engagement with the forces under siege in the Arab region, although again, it's getting better. There are not a lot of engagement with the Latin American radical states. In fact, just the opposite, I think. I think it's usually distance from those states in favor of what are called grassroots movements, although, you know, grassroots is always a tricky term, given the predominance of NGOs across South and North in terms of structuring politics. And so those are the basic issues as I see them. So, but with that said, you know, I think the degrowth is doing a lot of work, and I think the recent articulations about degrowth are often great, and there's a lot of common ground between the forces. The question is, what is, you know, what kind of political program is going to be put forth by these forces? And so pitching it as degrowth versus eco-socialism, I don't always find that very productive.
A quick follow-up with, I mean, you referred to the notion of ecologically unequal exchange, and this is also a source of a controversy, right? There's the whole question, underlying question of the valuation of nature. There are people like Jason Moore who put an emphasis on cheap nature and so on. And there's another trend who sticks closer with the Marxist law of value and raise the question of if it's possible to basically value the nature. So do you think the two are compatible with each other? Because I am also following these controversies and I have my own reservations, but I was just curious about your take. So ecologically unequal exchange, the question of value, is it compatible with the Marxist law of value?
Yeah, you know, what I think is instructive in some sense is if we go back to the arguments about Latin American structuralism and the uneven terms of trade and so forth, right? You know, which I'm not sure everyone will be familiar with. I mean, what was theorized, so I'll just quickly say it, which is what was theorized in the late 40s and early 50s from Latin America was that the exports from the South were trading for ever fewer of what was produced in the North. So if a bushel of coffee bought a half a car in 1940, it bought a quarter of a car in 1950, right? So it's clear that this is a mechanism for world scale polarization of accumulation, right? If you have these types of these types of trade dynamics that are spreading all over the world and that are across all sectors. Now, I mean, it took a while for Marini, for example, to put this type of thinking on a more even footing, on a more sound footing, and to say that actually a very central feature of what was being theorized in Latin America as dependency was also super exploitation. That is, there was people in the South were being exploited at rates superior, at greater rates than people in the North. And this was one of the mechanisms that allowed for prices of the exports from the South to be cheaper or to be losing value against the way against exports from the north, right? Because and that was also, you know, and as our Argurian manual was arguing that this was related to trade unions able to more strongly defend northern wages. And of course, it took Amin to point out that it was also northern monopoly capital's violence that was also very integral to protecting this overall system of disorganization, of southern organization, with labor unions also signing on to northern imperialism and so forth, right? And then it was Dussel, I'm sorry for this excursion, but it's, I think it's instructive. And it was Enrique Dussel who pointed out, okay, actually Marini's theorization of dependency itself was not accurate. We actually need to be thinking about dependency as a structural flow of value from less developed national capital, in other words, the South, to a more developed national capital in the North. And that could take on a multitude of forms. And this was based on, he did this based on a rigorous reading of Marxist manuscripts, right? This type of reading, this type of work has not occurred yet for ecologically unequal exchange, in my opinion. I mean, I think Jason Moore is offering some methodological cues. I mean, I think the focus on the world system is totally central. The cheap nature, one can also say the under reproduction of nature is the issue, right? Not quite, which, if it's cheap, then it's easier to under reproduce it, right? But cheap may be a wrong way of framing the issue. So I think we are empirically, there's a huge amount of work in the last 30 years, especially the last 20 years, showing that there are these phenomena of disproportionate damages to southern natures vis-a-vis northern natures, right? And also northern grabbing of the waste spaces in the atmosphere for carbon dioxide. That is, the global space to absorb carbon dioxide was enclosed in effect by the North, which we can think of as primitive accumulation, but also the northern theft of southern nature. Now, of course, here we're still dealing with biophysical aggregates, which is not what Marx was talking about, right? Now, where I think that needs to go is, and I'm working on this, don't take my idea, anybody. No, anyone can take it, but is that this is also, it registers for working classes in the under reproduction of the natural conditions that are necessary for a decent life. Right, and that this is registered in, you know, people dying before their historically appropriate level because the natural background or terrain upon which people would live decent lives is being degraded by the entire law of value on a world scale. Right, I think, and I'm not much of a value theorist, but I think this is where the ecologically unequal exchange debate should go in order to put it on firmer Marxist footing. And I think, you know, Marxists should take it up in a more open way. I think part of the problem is that it's been done very well by natural and kind of social scientists with a quantitative inclination, and they have a lot of interesting findings. So the point is to develop those findings rather than say it doesn't comport with Marxist orthodoxy, right? I think that's just not a very productive way when people are clearly talking about a phenomenon that is affecting people's lives, right? And that needs to be explained somehow.
Okay, we have two final questions. The first one is, as far as I understand, it is a technical question, again, from the audience. The person is asking why you call your proposal a Green New Deal, because, for example, in the context of Europe, the proposals put forward by the Greens and youth and supported by the lobbies are also referred to as Green New Deals. So why not pick a different name, again, if I'm understanding the question correctly, and stick with the established name of Green New Deal?
You know, the slightly irresponsible answer is that I did not even name my book. And I don't even like to name my own articles, title my own articles. So they just presented it and I was like, whatever, sure. Which is a ridiculous answer to a serious question, but is actually the truest answer. Right. After the fact, I guess kind of justify it. I mean, I had used the phrase the People's Green New Deal in certain articles, I think. And, you know, I do like the term the people, of course. I have like some populist inclinations coming from my work on agrarian studies and so forth, and coming from engagement with national populism in the periphery, or nacional popular, especially coming from Latin America. I think it's a very important way of thinking about social transformation. I do have a worry that, like, you know, I do think that in the North, people could rethink of themselves as some sort of people that's our commonwealth or republic that is anti-colonial and anti-imperial. Do people want to be thinking themselves as like a militant Marxist proletariat? I don't think so, but I don't know, actually. So that's another aspect, is that I don't mind the term the people. The Green New Deal, truthfully, someone could say it's a mistake, and I don't know how much I would be able to rebut that position. Some people have definitely told me, they're like, yeah, we thought you were just writing some liberal crap, calling it a Green New Deal. Like, why would I read such a piece of trash? And I was like, well, it's not so liberal, but you should check it out first. But I can't say their reservations have no substance.
Okay, and the final question is, so, ideally, of course, the ecological struggles should be united at an international level, right? What can you say on the state of the ecological struggles in especially the southern countries that you're familiar with, be it Indonesia or other countries, because the Marxist Ecology Collective, which is organizing this event, is actually very much interested in establishing permanent lines of cooperation, platforms of cooperation with other, preferably Marxist ecological movements in other countries. So also someone from the audience has asked a similar question. Basically, what can you say about the state of international organization of the ecology movement? That was
right.
And short, yeah.
It strikes me that it's very tricky, and it's tricky going back to some of the discussions we had earlier about relative prioritization of ecological or class struggles. Of course, I think international communication between various movements is very important, but how far should that go? And is that the basis for, what is the basis for a new unity, right? In fact, I think, I think ecological transformation in the periphery, socialist ecological transformation is critical, but at the same time, the ecological crisis is not the South's fault. The ecological crisis is the North's fault. And insofar as it affects Southern social reproduction, that those are very serious issues. And of course, a lot of that is related to imperialism and waste dumping and so forth, right? And so those are serious issues that need to be struggled out. But I think there's a problem, it seems to me, that there's a lot of hostility towards Southern states within a lot of eco-socialist thinking, right? And this isn't to say that Southern states like Bolivia and Venezuela and Ecuador have not had uneven ecological policies and records. They certainly have, right? But people are, in terms of a reconstitution of an eco-socialist international or fronts, how is it orienting to these states that on the international stage, at least, have excellent ecological records, and then internally are in a subordinate and polluting position in the international division of labor, and yet also have at the discursive level a very strong ecological discourse, right? And this is a question that would be answered only in practice, rather at the level of organization, rather than at the level of rather than in a discussion. But this is central to thinking through how to form an international front. It seems to me that, if it's about sharing resources and pushing a Southern ecological discourse and reconstituting a Southern ecological discourse, then I think it's critical, right? In terms of South-South, I think South-South communication is important and people are aware of each other's problems. I think that's so important. And in terms of disciplining Northern ecological movements, I think it's very important, right? Because the tendency will be towards racism, chauvinism, and imperialism unless they're disciplined through accountability structures to Southern thinking, right? But should that be constructed in separation? Looking towards the medium horizon, should that be constructed in separation or building towards people calling for new non-aligned movements or new bandans or new tricontinentals, right? That is the question. And I think it should be feeding into that, which means taking the national question seriously enough that there may be forces with uneven or necessarily uneven ecological records who would be part of such a front. But it needs to be worked out in practice.
Okay, so thank you. And I know I keep saying this, but this is really the final question. Do you have any special messages to the Turkish language readership of the book? Anything you want to say in particular?
Well, one of the questions I was asked in actually an interview that I don't know was maybe just published online, and I don't know if it was part of the book or not. But what I would love to see, both for purposes of the kind of endogenous construction of the eco-socialist discourse in a place like Turkey, but also feeding into to feed into and enrich both other global South and also Northern discussions is, I would love to know, like, what were people talking about in the 70s and 80s? Because every third world country that I've looked into, I've started to look into a lot, had an ecological discourse in the 70s and 80s, right? And with varying intensities, but it was part of the discussion. It was part of the discussion in different, it emerged in a different context related to the energy crisis, reaction to Northern environmentalism, the limits to growth reports and so forth. But it was very much part of the discussion, right? And there were, and also the context of the international division of labor and people's awareness that there was resiting of polluting industrial plants from the north to the south. But this is so central for people to go back to. And like, I don't read Turkish and I'm not going to learn Turkish, but I would love to learn from the comrades in the audience, and the Turkish audience, about what people were discussing, and like bring that into the collective discussion.
I think I'll confine myself to saying that we would love to, gain this dialogue and eventually organize maybe another event, maybe a round table or something more participatory along these lines. That would be perfect, actually.
I'm at your disposal. I mean, with all that for you guys to translate the damn book, I'll do whatever you guys want.
Right. I think that's a great conclusion.
Yeah.
I mean, once again, thank you very much for participating today, and I hope you get better.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks for all your efforts.